Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Michelle Whitty here with Bob Schlehuber, starting our second hour, and we are going to talk about the economy. We're going to talk about jobs, gender, and the workforce, and more, and we are going to start it all off by viciously attacking the Wall Street Journal. It's going to be fun. And if you want to pile on, you can call us at 202-521-1320. And Bob and I are not in this fight alone. We are joined by Steve Grumbine, founder and CEO of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and host of the podcast Macro and Cheese. Steve, thanks for joining us again.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad you're here because I want to complain about the Wall Street Journal for a minute. And so I'm going to ask you both to bear with me because I have a lot of notes, but they are going to bring me to a point. So yesterday I was listening to the Wall Street Journal's morning briefing, and I was struck once again by the way we discuss economic fluctuations and particularly the way we obscure human responsibility for them. So yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had an expert on to talk about how this economic crisis and recovery, how long it might last. And he used this really dishonest and evasive language the whole time, making it seem as though economics and the economies of our countries are like medicine or ecology in that they are extremely complicated and evolving and very personal and kind of mysterious, really, and not something we mortals should assume we have any control over. So I want to break it down. This expert started by saying, since the 80s, it's been taking longer and longer to recover from economic shocks. And I have a problem with that. Economic recoveries are not natural processes like a warm fall or a wet spring, but this is always how we allow them to be discussed. This expert attributed these slow recoveries to structural changes that happen in an economy in a downturn, and warned that the shutdown we've experienced might not lead to any reopening. And again, I just want to note the passive voice here. Structural changes that happen. The shutdown we've experienced, like no person is doing this, right? It's like brain cells die when the body is deprived of oxygen or something. But in economics, people are responsible for these changes to a large degree, right? And the Wall Street Journal just doesn't want to say so, maybe because it plays a role in providing cover to all the people who are actually benefiting from these crises and just stacking their cash as usual because, hey, they just got lucky and it's not their fault. It's not their fault, and it's not our government's fault, and it's not a deliberate design to leave some people to suffer and allow others to prosper. But no, like, according to this Wall Street Journal expert, we might as well just be talking about the falling leaves and the way the snow dances in the wind. He actually ends by using an analogy of a heart attack, saying during a heart attack, the first thing you do is get the heart muscle going again, and then you check for damage to the muscle that makes the heart work. And his muscle damage analogy covers areas like retail, like airlines that are hemorrhaging jobs. But again, it's not as a result of muscle damage that we don't know how to fix. You know, at the very least, the human suffering resulting from this muscle damage, right, is not inevitable. And so I feel like in the end, all of that language, all of that like distancing verbiage is to soften us up for this blow when he tells us the restructuring that happens in a damaged economy like that means workers are laid off and some of them become unemployed for long periods of time. Again, it's just always this language of no responsibility. And I think it is to keep people from being able to identify the governments and individuals directly responsible for the suffering. It's so dishonest. And I'm done ranting now. So Steve, I just want to say, like, we have talked a lot about the mystification of economic processes here and the consequences of that. And so I wonder if you could just comment generally on my little like textual analysis here and give us your thoughts on what kind of impact this language has on how people understand the economic forces that influence their lives.
Well, you know, first of all, you did great. I was just cheering you on. I'm like
Thanks.
furious when I listen to this stuff, and it's like this is an ideological gift to the free market world, right? Of course, there's nothing that happens that's not part of the natural market cycle. You know, when we have a downturn, naturally people will have to be let go, and naturally we'll have to retrench, and naturally capital will buy those assets on pennies on the dollar and retrench and start all over again. That's the natural process. And it's FUBAR, it's a lie, as you're well aware. What they do is they fundamentally ignore, right from Jump Street, they ignore that when you look at that piece of paper, that U.S. dollar, right, signed by the Treasury, that dollar comes from our government. Well, it doesn't generate because of somebody's productive value. It generates because the government spends it into existence on something. Okay. And so the reason why they have dollars to do any of the things that they're doing to begin with is because at some point in time, the federal government spent that money into existence. And you start asking yourself, if they're going to just act like this is some natural phenomenon, that we always have unemployed people, that the market isn't bad or good, it just does what it does, it's a lie. It's a lie. You know, Jamie Dimon famously said that, hey, these recessions, they're probably not real good for everybody else, but for J.P. Morgan, they're great. And we do great things during these things. They make money hand over fist. So, as you're talking about watching people get laid off, and you're watching natural markets, and you're watching this Wall Street Journal guy try to prep us all, soften us up for the expected downturn, like there is no alternative. And that's what everybody starts absorbing into their psyche. There is no alternative. This is just the way it is. Why, oh, why is this happening? And there, it's not almost. It is an absolute cruel lie. And you know as well as I do, given that we've talked so many times, I hope you know anyway at this point, the federal government spends that money, and it could offset every one of these things. There's nothing here that is natural. Everything here is a direct result of not enough deficit spending on the right things, not enough, reaction to support the regular people. The goal here is to give the power to Wall Street. Wall Street then becomes your de facto government. Wall Street then makes its decisions based on its bottom line, as opposed to we, the people, and the federal government making decisions on what kind of society we want to be in. And I think that right there is a fundamental divide that speaks directly to your rant.
Yeah, and I think, more and more, I think that fostering economic literacy as part of a political education for people in this country is really important. And so I feel like it's also really easy to get stuck on the diagnosis here. And I'm kind of surprised it's taken us so long to ask you directly about the work you do in spreading some of this economic literacy. So I wanted to ask, what you're doing with the Macro and Cheese podcast, what kind of feedback you're getting, and what have you observed about the state of economic literacy among the American public, what their appetite is for economic content, like what they get, what they resist, that kind of thing?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. We're getting around 40 to 45,000 downloads a month right now of our podcast. And for an economic podcast led by activists, granted, yes, we have experts on, but for that 40,000 downloads, that's a lot of downloads. It's a lot of people spreading the word. And if you think about it, a lot of the subject matter that we did, we've kind of built building blocks here. We started off with a very dry kind of assessment of what theory is and what MMT is, or modern monetary theory, which is description of the way that economics works today since the end of the gold standard. It's not something that has to be implemented. People just are unaware of it. So we took a crack at trying to expose people to how economics works in our current environment. And then as we got through the nuts and bolts and blocking and tackling of that, we started getting more into the social side because it's very difficult for people to take an abstract concept of just economics, macroeconomics at that, because most people are focused on microeconomics, the stock market. How do I make money here? What do I invest in? That's the sort of mindset that they have. But macroeconomics is about the plumbing of aggregates. We're talking about how the federal government makes decisions of taxing this or regulating that or trying to disincentivize certain behavior that is counterproductive to not only the environment or the people's lives or the economy, but maybe, changes in legal standing, et cetera. So, it's all about the legalities and so forth as well. So people oftentimes skip that part because it just doesn't seem connected to them personally. And in fairness, it's one of the most misunderstood concepts out there. So what we've done is we've taken social issues, things that have erupted from an understanding of class struggle and understanding of racial dynamics, in particular in light of Black Lives Matter and so forth, trying to understand a lot of the programs that folks like Bernie Sanders put forward. People laughed at him. They literally Hillary Clinton, I'll never forget laughing at him in the middle of their debates in 2016, where she called his proposals pie in the sky. And how are you going to pay for it, Bernie? And Bernie sat there and was terrified to answer the question. He was offering up $33 trillion in new spending with only $19 trillion in taxes. So where's that extra money coming from? And these are questions that only right-wing rags actually picked up on. The left and the center, they didn't even say a word about it. But the right-wing rags ragged on Bernie big time and said, where is this money coming from? Is it going to just magically appear and stuff like that? And yes, it actually is. The federal government is going to actually just spend that money right into existence like it did the F-35 fighters and everything else.
Steve, let me just jump in here. Bob Schlehuber here, Michelle Whitty, Steve Grumbine. Steve, thanks for joining us today on Political Misfits. And yeah, that's the thing that just keeps echoing in my head. I was in Iowa for the caucuses and I was with some family in Des Moines and I said, well, who are you guys supporting? And it was the same kind of narrative that I heard when I talked to other people that were not supporting Sanders. They were supporting Pete Buttigieg, but the same thing for Biden. And I said, well, don't you guys have student debt? And they go, yeah. I go, what do you want that erased or get rid of that? And they go, well, yeah, that would be great, but we can't afford that. And then same thing with the Biden supporter, a Black woman in her 50s or 60s. I go, do you have healthcare? She goes, no. I go, well, Biden wants to have universal healthcare and make it extremely easy for you to have healthcare. And she goes, oh, I would love that, but it's just not realistic. And that's where I think politics in the United States, Steve, has really become a kind of politics of where perception is the reality. And I think that was really fascinating looking at the exit polls of what won for Donald Trump in, say, Iowa, but lost things there from Pennsylvania. Same with how did Trump win Florida and how did people in Michigan decide to go back towards the Democratic Party. And you just look at how people felt about the economy. And so much of it wasn't about the material conditions that they had. It was about their perceptions towards the economy. It wasn't realistically based in how they were actually doing. But if people said that they perceived to have been doing better in this economy over the last 4 years, they were voting for Donald Trump overwhelmingly, 70, 80%. If people thought things had stagnated or things were getting worse, they overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden. They all live in the same economy, Steve. They all have the same material conditions, or at least context that they're all existing within. But perception was so wildly different. And that, for me, is how American politics is run.
It is. And, one of the things that you mentioned there is the lack of imagination that austerity politics breeds. These people want these things. Of course I want that. Of course that would be great to have, but we just can't afford it. We just can't afford it. It's always this concept of we just can't afford it. And the reality is the one thing that we have absolutely no problem generating is U.S. dollars. Is the one thing people are concerned that we don't have enough of. It's the real resources that we have to consider, whether we are at full employment, whether we have enough houses, whether there's enough doctors, whatever the thing that we're trying to get, whether there's enough oil or gas or whatever it is that we're trying to do. And so when you look at the scarcity of resources, that's really where our focus needs to lie. And if you think about it from a macro perspective, like I was pointing at, you begin to realize that the government's ability to spend money is what actually organizes those resources to begin with. By the government spending that money into existence, that's when the industries start responding. Hey guys, did you look out there on USA grants or whatever? It looks like all the money's going to be spent on green energy. We better start ramping up green energy. And all of a sudden you see these companies running around trying to get that U.S. grant money so that they can go ahead and get funded for these green energy initiatives. It all is a matter of political will. It's got nothing to do with financial. But the American people are so used to looking at their bank account and assessing the viability of what the government can do based on what's in their checking account and whether they can overwrite a check or, whatever. They tend to very, very conservatively think about the realm of possibilities. And that is what is going to have to change. And that is part of the great lead-in that you guys did. We absolutely must focus on, economic education. We got to make it fun too. We got to reach people where they are and not make them have to have like a master's degree in, mysticism to be able to understand it. They got to be able to have it where they are in a consumable fashion right here, right now. And if you think about that in that way, I mean, the Biden campaign, it's no secret. I'm no fan of Joe Biden, and I'm no fan of Kamala Harris, and I'm no fan of how they got selected for the role. That said, the opportunity for activists right now and the work that we're doing in particular is to, in fact, educate people so that they say, Joe, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to spend. And to talk to Republicans, too, because, if we stop thinking in partisan, binaries and we start thinking in class binaries and start considering that the white workers, the black workers, the gay workers, the straight workers, all of us are labor. And if we start considering ourselves from that lens and we start thinking about what's good for labor is good for us, then you're going to start seeing some fundamental change. I think that right there, that class struggle is so intricately tied to red scare, red baiting, that we have lost the concept of what it means to be the working class in this country. And so I think a lot of that paradigm changing, taking away the stigma of socialism. And in fact, let me tell you, we're about to start another podcast to go along the side of Macro and Cheese. It's going to be called The S Word. And I don't need to tell you what the S word is probably, but just for the sake of it, socialism, struggle, solidarity, okay? And so the idea will be not a master class in this, but it'll be a group of people, 4, 5, maybe 6 people, that really don't know a whole lot about socialism, talking about their ideas. And we'll be bringing in guests that really do know what they're talking about. And we'll have reading assignments. We'll talk through, like, what do you think about this? What is to be done by Lenin? Or, what, all these different things that nobody ever cared about, nobody would ever care about, nobody would ever read. But all of a sudden, a bunch of regular people are going to be taking away the stigma of the S word. And so all these things, I think, are really going to be wonderfully, wonderfully positive, I hope.
That is really exciting, Steve. But I got to draw your attention to another working binary here, and that is the divide between people who are working from home and people who are going out to work their jobs, because apparently Deutsche Bank wants to drive a wedge between these two kinds of workers and is suggesting that we put a tax on people for working from home. This was a suggestion by Deutsche Bank strategist Luke Templeman in a new report that says, I guess workers who aren't leaving their houses aren't paying into infrastructure that already exists and not paying into the system the way workers who go out of their houses to do their jobs do. And I have to say, when I first saw this suggestion, I was immediately furious because that's not hard to do. But it's also not like working from home right now is some huge luxury. And of course, there are so many other people to tax. The idea comes off as like, hey, you slobs, you need to do your part to keep our cities running while you're there, enjoying being trapped in your house for months on end. But to be honest, the proposal isn't quite as egregious as it seems. It would be a tax of 5% on employers of people who work from home. And the idea is the income would be paid out as grants to workers who can't work from home and who don't make much money. And again, they sound nice, but Steve, there's surely another way to support low-income workers than by taxing people who employ people who stay at home.
Absolutely. Just so we're on the same page, it is bad. Your first impulse was correct. And the reason for that is this. Number one, we like to think of taxing bads, not goods. Okay, and working remotely is good. It's helping the environment. It's doing all kinds of things. It's making communities stronger, families stronger. It's providing more self-realization time, which actually helps with mental health and all kinds of other things. I mean, so there's a slew of benefits from this. And the idea of not funding infrastructure is a political decision. Okay, now I will tell you this, and this is an important distinction. I want to make this before I let this point go. States and local governments are tax-driven governments. They require receipts, they require revenue to spend on things. However, the federal government has none of that. The federal government requires a tax to make the money matter, to make it hold its value, to drive the need for the currency, but it doesn't require revenue to spend. So the idea that somehow or another we got to tax the goods of remote work so that we can support the infrastructure at a state and local level, maybe I buy that to some degree. I don't, but maybe I do. But I know for a fact that the federal government could say this is not only is it a health imperative that we do this remote stuff, but it's also an environmental imperative that we remain remote as much as we can. And we are going to incentivize those low-paying jobs to, in fact, maybe even if you're willing to make them remote too. If you can't make them remote, if they can't be remote, maybe you give them hazard pay or something to that effect, right? Whatever. But I think that there is no reason under the sun that you would tax people from working from home, when in reality what you're doing is you're punishing a good, and as opposed to actually punishing a bad. And the federal government is the one that can handle this without any kind of help whatsoever. So I say hooey on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd too, Michelle, because I know, again, we don't want to talk about future problems when we have so many problems right here in front of us. But if it comes to actually getting coronavirus under control, I just don't imagine how we don't have to link together the vaccine with some type of a shutdown, or at least not opening back up. But with record cases continuing to rise, I just don't understand how people think that we're going to get a grasp on the coronavirus with a vaccine that's incredibly difficult to distribute around the country without some type of modified shutdown order. And so people do need to be primed and ready for this. And the federal government, Joe Biden's administration, will have to be able to support people much better than the Trump administration did when they had a turn to.
I mean, Bob, I just have to say, it's a great line again from the Deutsche Bank advisor, Templeman, who says, quite simply, our economic system is not set up to cope with people who can disconnect themselves from face-to-face society. And I just think, well, okay, blow up all the yachts then. You know what I mean? Like, Elon Musk is trying to go to Mars, for God's sake. And yet the fault lies with people who are working from home to try and not spread this pandemic. I mean, it's unbelievable. But I feel like, my tendency is also to sort of see the narrative shaping going on here. And I don't know, you can call me a little paranoid, but I do think there is a lot of work going on right now to drive wedges between natural allies, and I think there was a lot of that in trying to exacerbate, I think, racial divides among working people when you saw some of these protests, or racial divides among people who were, out protesting together, trying to be allies in the street for racial justice over the summer. And, I would not be surprised if, if it serves the powers that be to decide we're going to try and pit the essential workers versus the workers at home and try to prevent them from seeing that they should be organizing together during this pandemic. Steve, I got one more question to ask you about the labor force and gender in the labor force here. We had a Washington Post story from last week that noted that the recession seems to be hurting women more than men when it comes to falling out of the workforce. It says the share of women working or looking for work has fallen to the lowest level since 1988. And according to the Labor Department's most recent jobs report, there are 2.2 million fewer women working or looking for work now than in January, versus 1.5 million men. And so 39% of women's jobs have been recovered versus 58% of men's. And a lot of this seems to be related to childcare. And this is one of the most telling statistics here. It says 865,000 women dropped out of the labor force as school started in September, compared to 216,000 men. So I just wondered what these numbers tell you. And I'll tell you what I'm thinking. Like, I wonder what that means for the industries that women traditionally dominate, right? Hospitality, service industry, cleaning, education, healthcare administration. Are there implications for these entire industries based on this exodus of the labor force?
I think first things first, it's clear that this shows a little bit of the lingering effects of patriarchy, right? Women are still seen as the matriarchs and the maternal ones, and they oftentimes, and some of this is societally driven and some of this is personal choice, right? I know that even though I'm kind of Mr. Mom during the daytime hours because my work allows me to work remotely. My wife, however, is unable to work remotely. So I have been doing cyber school with my daughter. I have been doing special needs school with my son. But I see this kind of as it's a societal norm that is slowly changing, but it is slowly changing. It's not changing as fast as maybe we would like. But I also think that there's a lot of personal choice that goes into this. I mean, still you can tell by the wage gap that men typically still make more than women. And with that in mind, families have to make a choice. Which income can we live with less? The lesser income or the greater income? And I think families are saying, well, you make more, and if I'm going to be out of the workforce or whatever, then I'll take the hit. And so I think you're seeing a little bit of the fallout from the wage gap as well. As far as the industries go, I think those industries, if they really need those workers, will pay the amount of money they need. They will provide the home health care. They'll provide the daycare. They'll provide whatever they need to supplement or offset, if in fact it's causing a delta in their work. I don't believe that's as much of a problem, especially with hospitality and stuff like that. People are still going out to eat and doing different things, but it's nowhere near what it used to be. I mean, I know for a fact that I would rather order everything that we get online than step foot into a maskless Walmart. I don't want to go anywhere where I'm worried about sneezy, snotty guy touching the food that I'm going to be buying. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen remotely too, but I guess there's a little bit of you're mitigating a little bit of that by not putting yourself directly in the line of fire as well. So I don't know that necessarily will impact those industries long term. I think that they can do whatever they need to do. But I also think that there's a fundamental issue here with when you see people fall out of the workforce, you ask yourself, why is that? And I think that we start realizing the limits of automation. You need care workers. You need tutors. My daughter, for example, struggles with reading. And if I'm working, and when my wife comes home from a long day at work, I mean, she's sitting there trying to do language arts with my daughter, and she doesn't want to, and she's tired and she's exhausted. These are some real opportunities there for remote tutoring, and there's some new ways of looking at the world that maybe our imagination hasn't quite allowed us to catch up to yet. So, I have a little different take on that, just a little bit.
I also wonder, before we let you go, if you must have seen the flurry of headlines yesterday about Laila Brainard and the potential that she's going to be tapped for a Treasury Secretary. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on her or on any of Biden's economics and labor advisors on his transition team.
Yeah, I'm not looking, I don't have a real optimistic view. Everybody that I've seen is largely neoliberal. I saw Bernie floated around as labor secretary. I saw a couple other people that are not horrific, but they're all bad in my opinion. I did not see very many people. In fact, this Treasury person is absolutely not who I would pick. Bernie Sanders' former economic advisor, Stephanie Kelton, would make a phenomenal Treasury Secretary. And I think that you would see drastic changes if that were to have taken place, if she would have been one of the people selected. But you don't see those kinds of caliber of people in any of, and I looked at all the quote unquote floated names that were out there. And absolutely every one of them, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, buried down at the bottom, kind of made my skin crawl, including Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren has kind of lost her shine over the years, and I think that a lot of people look at Elizabeth Warren a little bit differently now. So I don't have a whole lot of love, if you will, for any of the cabinet selections that I see Biden trying to advance, not on his short lists anyway.
No, it's a lot of Obama 2.0, which sort of means like I think the recovery is going to look a lot like financial crash 2.0, which doesn't fill me with hope, really.
The only thing that I will tell you to give any hope is, number one, we saw a lot of things change during this pandemic. We saw a lot of people recognize the power of the federal government, even though they didn't use it to full effect. We got to see point blank that when the government wanted to spend, it spent. So there are people that are wide awake and aware of this, and they're not letting it go. So I think that there are people in positions of power, whether they find their way into a cabinet spot or just in an advisory role, people like Robert Hockett, people like Stephanie Kelton and Derek Hamilton and Mircea Baradaran and others. I think there are some really good people out there that are not going to let them wiggle away and just sort of fritter this away. I think that we do have some good people. I think there is some awareness. It's not where we would like it. Do I think Biden will do any of this without a strong kick in the tail? No. But then again, if you look at our Congress right now and our Senate, even the minor wins that we've had in the progressive caucus, if you will, with Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, and of course the squad all was reelected with AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar. I think that you're starting to see a little bit of a crack in that, but we don't have nearly the votes in either House of Congress. We don't have any support in the White House, and Kamala Harris, quite frankly, may be worse than Joe Biden. So we have a real struggle there, and it's going to take what you said to begin with. It's going to take a real immersive education of the public, meeting them where they need to be to help them learn about economics, to help them push this administration, if there's any prayer, to push this administration in a humane direction.
I guess the good news is we've got you with Macro and Cheese, and we've got people we were just talking to in the previous segment, a couple of segments working hard on behalf of workers, on behalf of immigrants, and the other people who are going to need to work together to push this administration. So that's good news. That's the hope we'll end on. That was Steve Grumbine, founder and CEO of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and host of the podcast Macro and Cheese and the upcoming podcast. What is that? The S word, Steve?
Yeah, we're going to be doing a new podcast where it's in concept mode right now called the S word. And I really think that this is going to be a great opportunity to really, really change the paradigm by which we operate from, as activists and as voters. I hope. That's my hope.
All right. Well, check all of those out, listeners. And you can hear Steve again very soon, I am sure, on Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. We're live in D.C., and we'll be back right after this.
Yeah.